If God does not exist, then there is no transcendent source of moral values. Rather, moral values are either just the byproducts of socio-biological evolution and conditioning, or else expressions of personal taste. As the philosopher of science Michael Ruse explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Richard Dawkins puts it succinctly: there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. In a world without God, there can be no objective right and wrong, only our culturally and personally relative subjective judgments. So, who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? Who's to judge that one person's values are inferior to those of another? The concept of objective morality loses all meaning in a universe without God. All we are confronted with is, in Jean-Paul Sartre's words, the bare, valueless fact of existence. That means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or bigotry as evil, nor can you praise tolerance, equality, and love as good. For in a universe without God, good and evil do not exist. There is only the bare, valueless fact of existence, and there is no one to say that you are right and I am wrong.
Idea revolution. Do you believe that we are in an idea revolution right now?
Well, this is what I think's happening. I think this accounts for the attractiveness of the content that I've put on YouTube. So when Nietzsche diagnosed the death of God about 150 years ago, and he made three predictions. He said, people will, as a consequence, our culture will shake to the roots. We'll become nihilistic or totalitarian in response, or we'll invent our own values. Okay, those were his three possibilities. And then of course we became nihilistic and totalitarian through the 20th century, and many tens of millions of people died as a consequence, which Nietzsche also foretold specifically. He said that 100 million people would die because of the rise of communist ideas. He said that in Will to Power. So then he predicted that, well, we would have to invent our own values. But then the psychoanalysts came along. They said, well, wait a second, you can't create your own values because you're not master in your own house. There are forces operating inside of you that are autonomous. And for Freud, those were primarily biological forces. But Jung took that a step further, and he said, well, wait a minute, biology is a lot more sophisticated and complex than you think, and there are symbolic forces at work. He thought of the archetypes as images of the instincts, for example, but the instincts were a lot more sophisticated than people thought. So it's not just an instinct to aggression, let's say. There's an instinct to operating properly so that you walk up hierarchies, human hierarchies of competence. It'd be something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's an archetype of the ideal in some sense. Jung thought the gods didn't disappear, they went inside, they went into the psyche, and so he dove down as far as he could dive to find out what those eternal images were and to bring them back up to the surface. And that's what I've been continuing, I would say, in my lectures. I'm saying, look, there are elements to the ancient story that are not only, they're deeply correct, and you cannot live, and you live in hell unless you know them. It's something like that, and that's the case. So, and I think I'm hoping that's what is happening, is that people are starting to understand that people's lives do have a transcendent purpose. That's the most appropriate way of looking at life, that our brains are in fact evolved to reveal that purpose to us, which I also believe. I think the neurological evidence in that regard is quite clear. I believe that. And so I'm hoping that what we're at the end of postmodern despair. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. So to me, what you're giving there is sort of a realist version of religion. You're saying these stories are needed for a very real way. I suspect you basically agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I do. And what's fascinating about this is, I mean, Jordan may be closer to Aristotle than I am to Plato, but I think that we almost have a Platonic versus Aristotelian argument going on here, because it seems like what you're talking about is the idea that if we dig down deep enough into our biologies and into our neural networks, what we find is a common set of shared values that, if you refuse to acknowledge them, leads to grave unhappiness. And what I'm almost
at every level,
right? And what I'm coming from is almost a Platonic idea, which is that the mind of man reflects the mind of God to the extent that you can, that not only is I would argue, as an Orthodox Jew, revelation is necessary, but even if you don't use revelation, that using your capacity to reason, you can find a purpose in something above. But we end up at the same place, which is the set of values that if you actually if you stray away from this common set of values, and I'm talking like the most root level values, personal responsibility, free will, it's your job to be responsible for members of your family. It's your job to make good decisions and responsible decisions and not to blame the society around you for failures that you are yourself responsible for. You can't surpass your own innate capacity in terms of, you can't expect society to make up for your lack of innate capacity in certain areas. You just have to make the most of what you have in front of you. You and I agree on the values, but I think that the source of the values, there's going to be a slight disagreement on.
I think it's a profound place for disagreement, because, and I don't understand how to mediate it exactly, because I'm not willing to dispense with the metaphysical.
I mean, this is essentially what I've said to Sam when I was debating him, is you know, he said, well, you know, a lot of religious people, and he sort of suggested that I, you know, think that atheists can't be moral people, and I said, I don't think that that's true at all. I mean, the point that I'm making is, you have to get to these values to have a civilization. How you get to those values, in my view, you know, I think requires a leap of faith. You can make that leap of faith a variety of different ways, but you're going to end up needing these central values at root if you're going to build a civilization off of that. So whether you do that through, you know, the kind of method that Sam wants to get to, what was weird is that, you know, Sam and I come from completely different perspectives on virtually everything, but we share probably 90 to 95% of our values. Yeah. And so what I would suggest is that those values are rooted in a Judeo-Christian civilization that is mixed with a Greek civilization that brought us to the same place, because we grew up 5 miles from each other. So of course we have the same values.
Right. His counter-argument to that basically would be that you're really talking about Enlightenment values, but you would say those values ultimately came from Judeo-Christian
but you know,
values.
the funny thing about that is that's actually a silly argument, that those are Enlightenment
values. I hope you guys will talk about this when you're on stage together.
I think the biologists have already made short shrift of that. It's like, Sam can't be an evolutionary biologist and say that the values that run Western civilization sprang from the Enlightenment. It's like you don't get to have those two time frames at the same time.
I may have slightly been putting words in his mouth there.
No. I disagree with you a little bit about the atheist issue, because I think this is the reason. It's like, if you think about the layers of the mind, with the iceberg analogy, it's like, well, you've got your patterns of action, and then you've got your justification for those patterns of action. You might think that those are rational, but then there's something underneath that, which is like the images that represent reality and the stories that represent reality, and then there's something underneath that even. And I think that to be religious is to have all of those things in order simultaneously. And I don't think that you can have an ethic that's only grounded in rationality, because I think the integrity of that rationality depends on the integrity of stories that you don't understand that exist.
So let me rephrase, because I actually agree with everything you just said. When I say that we have to agree on these values in order for us to build a civilization, how you get there is your own business, I mean on an individual level. I don't mean that every way you get to those values is equally valid. Right? I think that otherwise Sam and I would agree, right? I do not think that the mode of thinking from evolutionary biology to the values that I think are necessary for building a civilization are even...
See, I see weaknesses coming up in Sam's representations for this reason. The first thing is he has to dispense with consciousness, and he has to dispense with free will. And I actually think that's deeply problematic. And I think the reason he has to do that, and Dennett does it too, is because there is something metaphysically strange about consciousness. And you can't allow for that if you're a reductionist materialist. And so I'm more than willing to say, look, I don't understand consciousness at all. And the more I think about it, the less I understand it, because it seems to be the linchpin of being. Without consciousness, there's no being. You could say, well, the material reality continues. It's like, well, maybe and maybe not, because we do not understand the relationship between time and space and consciousness. So it's not self-evident that what you're saying is true. It might be true, but even if it was true, well, exactly how does the universe that has no consciousness in it exist? Like, how do you parameterize it? Does it have a duration? Does it have a size? Does it have any qualities? Like, what is it?
Well,
it's like a video game that no one's playing.
Right.
It's like, well, what is that exactly?
Well, this is where we get to, back to that 3-hour conversation that you and Sam had as to the nature of truth and what exactly truth is. And one of the things that I don't want to, critique Sam's ideology without him here to defend himself.
Although it's fun.
It is definitely fun, but we'll have to have Sam in here to actually do that, because it'd be a lot of fun. But one of the things that I've always found weird is that he and I have precisely the same notion of an objective truth, but I don't understand where he's getting his from. Meaning that, like, I'm getting.
Yeah, and I don't either. Like, well, and he also stresses.
Because if you base your viewpoint on materialist evolutionary biology, then what you would say is the truth is that which is most biologically successful, right?
That's the claim I was making when I talked to Sam.
Right, exactly, which is your claim, and also a claim that leads to religion, because biologically speaking, religious believers are more biologically successful than non-religious believers over the course of human history.
Religious belief evolved.
Right.
That's the thing. Not only did religious belief evolve, clearly it evolved. It's one of the human universals. The capacity for religious experience evolved. Well, you might say, why? Well, maybe you could take the viewpoint that seems to be characteristic of Steven Pinker and say, well, it's a spandrel. It's just a side effect of something more substantial. And my objection to that is, define your spandrels first.
Right, exactly.
You don't get to define them post hoc,
You don't get to you don't get to define away the side effects of the drug.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah. When people talk about drugs, very often what they'll do is they'll say, well, the drug is for a headache, but it has the side effect of causing you cancer.
Right.
And it's like, well, no, the drug causes cancer.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a side effect.
Right.
Yeah.
I've studied a variety of great psychologists. Jean Piaget and Carl Jung and Freud and Carl Rogers, many of the great 20th century clinicians. And my sense is that, along with the biologists and the evolutionary psychologists, that we're starting to map out the pathway that might be the opposite of the catastrophic mode of being that leads us into pits of hell like Auschwitz. And that there's something genuinely real about it. Like, seriously real. Metaphorically real and literally real, both at the same time. That the instinct to meaning that you experience, for example, when you listen to something great, that experience of meaning that overcomes you, isn't some epiphenomena. It's not some mere reflection of some more fundamental process, but that which is more fundamental than anything else. Say, well, you can't deny that pain is real and suffering is real, and you can't deny that suffering induced by malevolence is the worst of all possible sufferings. Those are all undeniable as far as I'm concerned. Those are all meanings of life. And they're real enough so that if you encounter them, like if you encounter true malevolence, the probability that you'll walk away from it unscathed is very, very low. It will damage you psychophysiologically, and you might never recover. And that's real enough for me. Well, is the path away from that real? Is the path that transcends that real? Maybe it's more real. That's what I've come to believe, as pessimistic as I am about the nature of humanity, myself included. As real as I believe suffering and evil to be, it appears to me that the mode of being that leads you away from that enables you to bear the suffering with nobility and to be useful to others who are in pain, and to constrain the malevolence in your own heart and around you, that mode of being is more powerful than that which it is set against. And not only that, I think that we experience this. I think we experience it. We just don't notice. Maybe because we're too busy thinking. Because noticing and thinking aren't the same thing. We see in our own lives when we're engaged in something deeply meaningful. Music is the best pathway to that, I think. It's the most rapid and indisputable pathway to that. Virtually everyone loves music, and music speaks of meaning. It does it directly. It shows you what life would be like if it was ordered and harmonious, and you were dancing along with it properly. It gives you an intimation of psychological integrity. But you watched your lives, day to day, week to week, month to month, you'll notice that there are times when you're so deeply engaged in what you're doing, when what you're doing is so meaningful, the kind of meaning that announces itself, not the kind that you're creating, that life is so meaningful, you think, this is worth the suffering. I've tried to work out the sorts of ideas that I portrayed in this talk today within a naturalistic framework as much as possible. Because the naturalistic technique is so powerful, not least for that, but also because there's glimmerings in the scientific literature of the sorts of ideas that you portrayed when you mentioned that the evolutionary biologists are increasingly making the claim that morality is a biological adaptation. And I think you can make a very strong case for that, a much stronger case than has actually been made so far. I think there is a very sophisticated ethic that has evolved that we recognize as a consequence of the evolution of our cognitive and emotional structures. I think that recognition manifests itself in admiration. People are very imitative. It's one of the things that characterizes us in contradistinction to animals who are not very imitative. It's probably the precondition for our linguistic capacity. One of the things that characterizes human existence is the capacity to spontaneously pick a model for emulation, right? A model for admiration. And that's the manifestation of that moral instinct. You say, well, to admire is to want to copy. You say, well, what do you want to copy? Well, you want to copy that which is most admirable. And what is most admirable? Well, what is most admirable, that starts to become a transcendent question, right? You can imagine that the local examples of what's admirable, they're right in front of you and they're concrete and tangible, but to abstract out from that which is admirable in and of itself is simultaneously to construct something like the representation of a transcendent good. And that's, to some degree, how religious conceptions emerge from their underlying biological substrate. Now, you might say, well, that's merely reducing the religious conceptualization, the religious abstraction of what's good, to the biological substrate. And I think you can read it that way, but I don't think that that necessarily indicates what it is. I think that the entire process of evolution is somehow shaping itself around maybe Platonic ideas, something like that, some transcendent good. And that it's a mistake to assume that just because you can make an association between the transcendent abstract good and the process of evolution, that one is necessarily reducible to another. It isn't the way reality works.
To commit the genetic fallacy, to try to say that because one's moral beliefs originated through such a biological evolutionary process, that therefore they are explained away and have no objective validity. That just is to commit a genetic fallacy.
I think partly what happens too is that you at that level of analysis, you have to start questioning your initial presumptions, like the idea that the most true truth is objective, because I'm not sure it is. I don't think we understand what constitutes truth very well. And there's the truth that you act out, as well as the truth that tells you what the world is made of. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. And so things get very murky at that level of abstraction. But one thing I have learned from attempting to reduce religious preconceptions to their biological substrate is that there's always something left over that you haven't explained. And it's not something trivial, because every time I look into what's left over, it turns out to be unutterably deep. And I get rid of some more of it, and the rest becomes unutterably deep. And so, yeah. Well,
okay. Thank you.
I had a dream. I had a dream once, and I'm speaking psychologically here, not theologically. I had a dream once. I was in the cemetery of an old church, an old cathedral, surrounded by the graves, and there were indentations in the grounds where all the graves were, and all of a sudden the graves started to open, and it was a graveyard where great people, great men of the past had been buried, and so grave opened and an armed king stood up, and then another grave opened and another armed king stood up, and this happened all around me, and these were very formidable figures, right? They were the great heroes of the past, and after a number of them appeared on the scene, they looked around and saw each other, and being warrior types, they immediately started to fight. And the question is, what stops the great kings of the past from fighting? And I had a revelation after the dream. I can't remember if it was part of it, but yes, it was part of the dream. They all bowed down to the figure of Christ. I thought, and then I woke up and I thought, what in the world does that dream mean? What in the world could that possibly mean? And then I understood it. I understood that if you have 20 kings, let's say, and you took the thing that was most king-like about each of them, and then you combined it into a single figure, then you'd get a single figure of transcendent heroism, of transcendent good. And it's a tenet of the Jungian school of psychology, let's say, that figure of transcendent good is symbolized by the image of Christ. And the purpose of that image is so that even the tyrannical king has someone to bend his knee to. And that's absolutely vital. I mean, you don't have to approach it from a religious perspective, although you inevitably do, because when you speak of things at this level, that's what happens. But you need an image of the transcendent embodied good to serve as something that unites the great tyrants of the past. It's something like that. It's an emergent vision of embodied unity. And it's a psychological necessity. It's a sociological necessity. And I think it bears very strongly on your question about why is it that people matter. It's the classic Western answer to that, the Judeo-Christian answer to that, is because you have a spark of divinity within you, and that divinity is a reflection of this transcendent good. And it's obligatory for me to recognize that in you, and vice versa, if we're going to inhabit the same territory without mayhem, peacefully, and with the ability to cooperate. Now, you might say, well, the mere fact that a transcendent image is necessary as a uniting figure doesn't prove the reality of that image. But I would say, well, yes, but it doesn't disprove it, and it strongly hints at something more profound, especially when you also ally it with the observation that the encounter with something truly admirable produces the instinct of awe. And that's not a rational instinct, it's an irrational instinct, but it's a marker that you're in the presence of something greater than yourself. And it's not something that you have voluntary control over, it's something that overtakes you. And it could easily be a reflection of the truth. Now, you can make a biologically reductionistic argument about that, but it starts to become extraordinarily difficult, because you enter into the realm where these transcendent experiences of religious significance and awe are a phenomenological and psychological reality. And it's not easy to explain why that's the case.